there was a certain idealization of the West, of course. It was the land of freedom and the land of wealth, of rich people, of better cars, of better living standard, etc. So it was all seen very positively, obviously, and it contributed again to how that regime couldn't be kept anymore in that closed fashion. I can say that to an extent, during the 1990s, a bit of the situation became more sober. People began to see the West or Western Europe in a more sober way, a more realistic way. It was no longer the idealized West that was closed down from Hungary, closed off of Hungary before. It was something, where we also were part of a dialogue, of exchange. We had economic relations, political relations. Joining NATO in 1999 was a very important step, and it contributed to a sense of security and a sense of belonging. It is clear that the migration issue is something that can change a country forever.
Oh yes,
forever.
Really.
And once you let that door open, once you sort of accept that illegal entry is basically okay, because you just have to arrive somehow, and in the end you will stay one way or another, because this is what's happening, this is what we see. Then there's no way back. You will not be deporting, hundreds of thousands of people out of your country. But if you do that, you will inevitably change your culture. It will inevitably change the identity of your country. It will change how people feel, your own people, at home. It will create situations where people who are, part of your nation start to feeling sort of uneasy in their own home. I think that the European Union should change fundamentally.
Welcome to the New World. Thorough conversations in times of change. My name is Adrian Verbrugge and my guest today is Balázs Hidvéghi. He is Parliamentary State Secretary of the Prime Minister's Cabinet Office in Hungary and a former member of the European Parliament for Fidesz. Welcome.
Hello.
Balázs.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah,
good
great to be here.
Thank you for the invitation.
In this lovely villa in the neighborhood of Rome. Our mutual friend Christian Alting van Geusau brought us together in this nice place, and I'm very thankful for that. So maybe just a short introduction. Can you tell us, the viewers, something of yourself, Balázs?
Yeah, I am Balázs Hidvéghi. I was born in 1970 in Budapest, Hungary. Both my parents are engineers. I have one sister. Grew up in Budapest, went to the university there and studied literature, history and international relations. Went to university in Budapest, but also to Leeds University in England, and later on in Strasbourg in France, at the Schumann University, where I did postgraduate studies. I always had an interest in politics.
You became politically active very early in your life.
Very early, but it was a good coincidence because born in 1970 meant that in 1988, 89, when all the big political changes took place in Eastern Central Europe, I was just 18 and 19, so in the best age in a way. And I attended demonstrations for democracy in the streets, and I joined Fidesz already then, back in 1989. And I've been active ever since then. We had a family background also about politics and public affairs. I remember my parents telling me about the 1956 revolution. Although at the time, during the 80s, it was a no topic. You couldn't talk about it in public, and it was obviously not allowed to celebrate it, but we celebrated it at home. We lit a candle on October 23rd, when the day of the revolution came, and my father spent some time in prison after 1956 for his participation. My mother was 16 when
he was a student at the time, or
he was a young engineer. And my mother was a student. She was 16. They both were on the streets. So it was a very, very lively and strong family background to it, and family stories that I heard. So that contributed probably to this interest in public affairs, in politics, which then came, towards the end of the 1980s.
Yeah, I visited Hungary, Budapest, when I was a student in 1986. I found it a great place, very, very kind people. Yeah. But of course, it was still the communist regime, you could say. At the same time, Hungary was a little bit different also at the time.
Yeah, it was goulash communism.
It was goulash communism.
And towards the end of the 80s, it was actually, it was the last few years of the regime.
There was a sense of freedom at the time, I think.
The Communist Party was already basically losing its strength. It was nowhere near where it was before. It was a soft dictatorship that was falling apart, basically. Yeah. And 86 was already the time of Mikhail Gorbachev in the USSR.
You could sense it. So.
And in Hungary, that contributed also to the change. We were then the pioneers of change in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, maybe just to reflect a little bit on this in this period. You were 16, 17, and 86. You already told us something, but what was this societal shift that you witnessed in this time, the 80s? What did you...
Well, it was a time really of a transition already. So on the one hand, economically, it was already a mixed economy. You had already the beginnings of private property. You could have your own little company. You could own a little bit of your own land. It was no longer a purely communistic state-controlled economy. And also in terms of free speech or criticism of the regime, it was opening up more and more every year. It was opening up, and then by 88, it was clear that János Kádár, the old leader, was too old, and he was then put aside, removed, and there was a new leadership. And then the big change was when even within the old Communist Party, a certain fraction did say that 1956 was in fact a revolution and not a counter-revolution, because this was the original official narrative name for it, or narrative, that it was a counter-revolution, something bad, something negative. And even then they realized that they had to accept the fact that it was a revolution for freedom and liberty and independence, and that the people of Hungary thought it was always a fight for the good. And so they accepted that, they admitted that. And very quickly led to a change of regime, demonstrations, and then finally the free elections in 1990 in the spring.
Yeah, at the time I remember that the European, of the Hungarian people I met, and also the friends of my sister, were very excited about the Western Europe. They wanted to talk, they wanted to hear the stories. They came and visit us. It was also possible. Maybe you could tell us something. Was this an ideal at the time to become like Western Europe?
Of course, yeah. I mean, it didn't begin then. It began already in the 1960s, when after the suppression of the 1956 revolution, the new regime was put in place led by János Kádár by the Soviet Union. And then some years of total repression came. But then, after about 62, 63, the regime opened up a little bit. And for instance, traveling was allowed to Czechoslovakia and then later on to Austria, for instance, or Western Germany later on. So the world a little bit opened up. And by the 80s, it was much more open. And yes, there was a certain idealization of the West, of course. It was the land of freedom and the land of wealth, of rich people, of better cars, of better living standard, etc. So it was all seen very positively, obviously, and it contributed again to how that regime couldn't be kept anymore in that closed fashion.
Yeah, of course, we see the end of the 80s, the Berlin Wall dropped down. We see the 90s, the end of the Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact. And Hungary, took its own course, you can say. Went his own specific way. When we take a look back, I think it was there was a unique development in Hungary compared to also, for example, Poland, and you did it in your own way. What was the role of the European Union at the time?
But first of all, in the beginning, it was Poland. Soon after, on the Czech Republic, because they separated from Slovakia. So Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, which were the farthest in terms of opening up and westernization and introducing the new democratic system. And we wanted to join everything that was, Western European. We wanted to join the Council of Europe that came very early in 1990. Of course, the European Union or European Community at the time. And then it took a longer time, and it was only in 2004.
2004, you became member.
When 10 countries of Central Europe together were admitted.
And what happened in those 90s?
There was obviously a great economic, reorganization of the country, which was hard, especially in the beginning. It came with the unemployment. It came with the closing down of old factories and the old industries, etc. Privatization came. So a lot of good things started, but it was painful for a lot of people, especially in the beginning. I can say that to an extent, during the 1990s, a bit of, the situation became more sober. People began to see the West or Western Europe in a more sober way, a more realistic way. It was no longer the idealized West that was closed off of Hungary before. It was something, where we also were part of a dialogue, of exchange. We had economic relations, political relations. Joining NATO in 1999 was a very important step, and it contributed to a sense of security and a sense of belonging to the Western alliance.
How did you look at the war and the violence in Yugoslavia and the Balkans? What was your interpretation of that conflict?
It was a wake-up call to a number of things. First of all, it was a wake-up call that not everything is just happy and pink and
when the old system is
forever.
Gone, there's not...
you see that some old tensions, emotions, political conflicts are still there, even after decades of communism in that country or decades of a federal system demonstrated by Tito. Those conflicts came up again. It was also a realization that the European Union or European Community had its very strict limitations in terms of not being a very strong geopolitical player. We witnessed this war raging on for 4 or 5 years, a lot of violence, a lot of human suffering, and the European Community, as strong as it was, as wealthy as it was, couldn't do anything really to stop it. And it had to be the United States intervening at the end, which brought an end to this conflict. It was a lesson to us that it's, of course, very important to work with our European partners, but there's no miracle there. The Brussels elite, the European community is not in a position or not ready, to even stop a war at its doorstep, right next to its borders. It was a very tough realization, as much as later on the Kosovo conflict and the NATO intervention in Serbia, just after Hungary joined, and it's a bordering country to us.
Yeah.
I mean, north of Serbia, there's also Hungarian community living. So we refused to take part in the bombardment because we didn't want, to make matters worse. But all that, the whole Balkan situation with these wars and conflicts, which still, in a way, are unresolved until this moment, show us that history lives on. All conflicts die in a difficult way. And there's a lot of effort necessary, political effort, strategic thinking to ensure peace, to avoid a military conflict, or to do something once a military conflict has started. It's very difficult.
So talking about this history, what's in your eyes the difference between, for example, Hungary and Poland?
Today?
Yeah, today, but also when you take a look at the development in the 90s, because you say you're bordering, in fact, Yugoslavia. So you had this connection, also in a cultural sense to
right.
It's
right.
Did it make you different and at the time?
Yes, to an extent. Although with Poland there is a very strong historical link between Polish and Hungarian people. There is a good positive feeling. Even now, when there is we don't agree on things, on the current Polish government and the current Hungarian government, we don't think the same thing about a lot of things. And especially the Polish Prime Minister is very critical of us, and he says that. But this is the surface. But below that, there is a strong historical tie between the two countries. These are old nations in Central Europe. They were old kingdoms. We were bordering each other for centuries. We fought a lot of wars together. We helped each other, vice versa. So that is still there. Today, from a Hungarian point of view, the Central European cooperation, the Visegrad Four, not only the Visegrad group, but in a larger sense, Central Europe as an idea, Central Europe as a region, is a very important determination, a very important conviction. Right now, the current Polish government is less keen on that. They are now playing more of a geopolitical role with the United States, a very strongly anti-Russian stance, etc. And they're very much active in the Ukraine conflict in a way. We are more prudent there. Our position about the Ukraine war and about the conflict with Russia, which is the real thing, is, I think, a more balanced and more prudent standpoint, which emphasizes not confrontation, but a ceasefire, a peace deal, and a strategic deal with Russia, where I think the European Union, including Central Europe, but not only Central Europe, the European Union should play a more active role as its own player, not as a subordinate to the United States or as a subordinate to NATO or something, but as a European player in that conflict. So there are differences, going back to your question, with Poland, but there's also some very deep link between the Polish and Hungarian nations, which lives on.
In his famous essay, A Kidnapped West, The Tragedy of Central Europe,
Van
Kundera. Kundera speaks of the cultural identity of and distinct character of Central Europe. At the line between East and West, and in a way between the North and the South. So it's a Central Europe. But at the same time, he points at the danger, because it's a very, also when you take a look at development also of Kundera himself, but at the danger of Central Europe losing its cultural identity by the influence of Western consumerism. When you take a look at what happens in Hungary, but also in Poland, is for the success of Orban, has it something to do with this? You can say an attempt to regain something of this cultural identity after the turn of and the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yes, I think so. And I agree with also the danger that Kundera talks about. I agree that there is a danger because of Western consumerism, which is now not only Western but globalism, and many of its characteristics. And obviously, Central Europe is no exception. We're also, and our societies, our people are under those influences. So there is that.
It's a very tempting way of life, of course.
It's a tempting way of life. It's very often an easier way of life. It's definitely a more popular or more accepted way of life in many ways in the media. So it's easy to let that sort of dominate you. At the same time, Central Europe has a long history. It's relatively smaller nations that from time to time have to realize that we need to build our efforts together, that together we as Central Europeans are stronger than if we always try to look to some bigger player, to our west or to our east or whatever it is. We need to stick together. Our history shows us that we have always been in a meeting point or in the conflict point often of bigger empire, or the Russian Empire, the Ottomans earlier, the Germanic influence, etc., etc. So that shows us that we need to work together and find our own identity, also within the European Union. That's
how would you describe this identity?
It's a traditionalist identity.
And what does that mean, traditionalist?
Where tradition is seen as a value.
Okay.
Where governments, the authorities, etc., leaders make an effort to maintain tradition, to respect it, to tell the story about our identities, our histories to our children, or where we want to build our future on ourselves. Why we are open to influences, obviously, and we're open to cooperation with others and EU and beyond. But we want to remain Europeans. We want to remain and we want to maintain our identity, our Christian roots. Not necessarily, going to church for everybody. That's a personal decision. But Christianity as part of our identity, Christian tradition, Christian, logic in how you see things. And you have to protect yourself today because there are very strong influences against that. That's why, for instance, in Hungary, we put down some clear values in our constitution to make sure that we give as much protection, even legal protection, to these things as possible. For instance, we put in our constitution in Hungary that Hungary is proud of its Christian tradition going back to Saint Stephen 1,000 years ago, the Hungarian kingdom. We put it down in the constitution that no foreign population can be forcefully settled into Hungary. That's a protection against illegal migration, which is a key challenge in Europe today. We also put down that we believe in the traditional marriage between a man and a woman. That family is important for us, and family policies and family support. Lots of things that are now debated elsewhere and put in question. We try to hold on to these values. And I think if you look at the whole Central European region, the larger region, there are similarities in how people think about these things and how they see a value in our past and in our presence and future.
Now, according to the European Values Survey, Europe has the most diverse values as a continent in the world. And of course, Central Europe has its own values. At the same time, you say it's a part of Europe, of course. Centers. Now we see that Hungary is, I would almost say, an outlier within the European Union. Is this, let's say, history you have in the 20th century regarding communism and Russia, an influence in the way you perceive the European Union and you deal with, let's say, ideological or bureaucratic ideological dynamics?
Exactly. Good question. It's right on the point. Sovereignty and independence and our own decisions about our own life is crucial to Hungarians. It has been throughout our history. We have had, a lot of influences, a lot of attacks on our independence throughout our history, from Tatars to Ottomans to Germans to the Soviets, etc. We've always stood against these. We've never given up our fight for independence. It was possible that we were occupied for a long time or others tried to influence our lives. But in the end, Hungary remained, even when those empires ceased to exist. We're still there, and we stick to these values. Sovereignty is key to surviving in Europe, and it was key. It has been key in our history to the maintenance of our language, of our way of thinking, and our decisions. And that continues. And that continues, as you said. And right now, when we criticize Brussels and the centralization efforts from there, or what we see as ideological warfare against a more Christian democratic traditionalist political line that we follow, then it's the same thing. It's still fighting for our sovereignty and the rejection of foreign influences when somebody else wants to tell us how to live, what to think, what to say, what not to say. Right now, we see the curbing of freedom of thought and freedom of speech very much coming from, for instance, the center of the European Union. That's wrong. We are pro-European cooperation. We believe in it, based on mutual respect of nation states cooperating, not a political committee in Brussels made up of unelected bureaucrats telling us, writing down what we can think about certain things and whatnot. That's not acceptable.
Yeah. When we go back to 2004, and the moment that you became a member of the European Union, and of course the ambitions you had in the 90s, how do you, what was the turning point? Well, you already talked about a little bit about the conflict in former Yugoslavia, and that was a kind of a shock what happened at the time for all of us, but especially for Hungary, of course. But after 2004, what are the decisive moments in which the relationship towards the European Union became more problematic?
Yeah, listen, I think it came 10, 11 years after we joined in 2005. 2015. And that was a migration crisis.
Yeah.
That was a turning point. It was not just one thing, obviously. It was more a process. Things, gradually got worse in Brussels, more centralization, more powers to the Brussels elite. But the turning point really came in 2015 when it became clear for us that there is a new approach to immigration, the mass immigration into the European Union, mass illegal immigration, and that this Brussels elite wants to force it upon member states to be part of this. And we didn't have it as a problem before. We never had any colonies. We lost our own territories. We didn't have any colonies, so we don't feel any moral obligation now to welcome millions of people from former colonies. We don't have that. And we want to maintain, as I said, our identity, our way of life. We want to maintain our cities as they are, our villages and the countryside as it is, with our own people, with an open heart towards others. We want to help those in need. That's why we began a program called Hungary Helps that takes aid in large quantities and good quality aid to the Middle East, to Iraq and to Syria and other places, especially helping embattled Christians, by the way, in these areas. But not only them, we're now aiding Ukraine with sending aid there and also helping the refugees.
And there is a Hungarian minority living in Ukraine
there
as well.
In the Carpathian region. That's one thing. But we don't only have them. We have them.
I understand.
But we have others, yes. Yeah. So that's our obligation. But it is clear that the migration issue is something that can change a country forever.
Oh, yes,
forever. And once you let that door open, once you sort of accept that illegal entry is basically okay, because you just have to arrive somehow, and in the end you will stay one way or another, because this is what's happening, this is what we see, then there's no way back. You will not be deporting, hundreds of thousands of people out of your country. But if you do that, you will inevitably change your culture. It will inevitably change the identity of your country. It will change how people feel, your own people, at home. It will create situations where people who are, part of your nation start to feeling sort of uneasy in their own home.
I understand, but let's get back to the drama of Yugoslavia in the 90s. Yes. And has it played a role in your let's say stance towards immigration and, for example, the position of Islam?
Not really. Islam was not a key factor there, basically. In the first part of the war, it was in Bosnia where you had partly a Muslim population.
Of course, Croatia, Serbia, there was also a religious division between them.
And it was about territory, and it was about independence and who makes decisions. So I didn't see actually religion playing a major role there. It was more about those countries fighting their own way and fighting about territory.
But cultural coherence, definitely.
Cultural coherence is a very important matter. But the war in Yugoslavia, which was between 91 and 95, and then later on 99 Kosovo, showed us that I think one thing is that war is still possible. It's not something of the past, of history books. It can happen, and you have to be very careful to avoid it. And secondly, it showed us that the European Union is not capable of solving this. This is what it showed me. The migration crisis later on in 2015, so recently, the past several years, that has a very strong cultural element to it, a very strong religious element to it. And it's also about who makes the decisions, who can decide upon a matter of who lives in a country. Is it a Brussels committee who decides that? Is the European Parliament? Well, we don't think so. I think we think it's sovereign nations who can decide about the parliaments, democratically elected governments. They can decide it. If a country chooses to become a migration country, some Western European countries have chosen that.
But of course that's...
They can do so, but nobody can force it upon us.
Yeah, no, I understand. But of course that's a different concept of Europe, European Union. In fact, I was very critical at the time, 2005, about the so-called European Constitution. And of course, you remember the Netherlands was one of the first countries who rejected this.
But then in the end, they brought it back.
They brought it back. And
that's a democracy deficit, as they say. It's a deficit in democracy.
Exactly. Now, you already mentioned the Ukrainian war. How do you reflect on the current developments in Central Europe? And in which this war plays, I think, an important role.
Of course, well, it dominates now the political
debates. But also your specific position within Europe.
Sure. We are, holding a position, and we're speaking about a position that is different from, in many ways, many others, or most of the other positions.
Now some of European, Central European countries are now following you, of course. Because
listen, let me put it this way: our position is and has been a realistic one, and I think a morally responsible one.
Mm-hmm.
We have been critical of statements from Western European countries and from Brussels about it is our war that's raging on in Ukraine, and Europe, the European Union, is going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. They keep saying things like this. They have been saying this without really taking the step of getting into the war. It's a statement. But it is sending Ukrainians to the front line. It is telling them to keep fighting, whereas they are losing their men
sacrificing their lives.
They are sacrificing enormously, slowly, it's true, but they are losing territory. And their situation now, after 3.5 years, is not better than it was back in when it began in 2022.
The Russians are fighting not a war on territory, of course, in the end, but first of all now a war of attrition.
Yeah. So and they are a bigger country. They are a nuclear power.
Yeah.
And it's not going in any positive way. Our position has been from the beginning that there should have been a political deal before already the war struck between European Union and Russia. A realistic geopolitical deal that accepts the reality that Russia is there where it is and is going to remain there, and it has and it can have security interests that it puts forward. We don't necessarily have to agree with those, or we don't have to like those, but it's the reality, and they have the weapons. And it's better, I think, and it would have been better, to strike a deal, avoid war, make compromise. For instance, to say for Ukraine that they dedicate themselves to be a neutral country militarily, and that they don't want to join NATO. They don't want weapons in their territory. Economically, they want to be open both towards Russia, which is their neighbor country, and they have been together for centuries, but also towards the European Union economically, but without a military aspect. Wouldn't that have been better for them and for the whole of Europe? I think it would have been better, but this was never said. It was always talking about the enlargement of NATO. It was criticizing Russia. And I think it all led to a situation where I'm not saying Russia is not responsible. Of course they are responsible. They are responsible for the attack. They're responsible for all the suffering they are causing. But I'm saying that there is a larger picture here, where more responsibility should have been given to avoiding this situation. And now that it wasn't avoided, I think the warfare and the killing must stop. And that's why we think that Trump's efforts to end this somehow, to make a deal, as he likes to say, are good. They're laudable. We like them and we support that. It's not going to be easy at all to make a deal. It's never easy, especially after a war or within a war situation. And it all could have been avoided, I agree. But now it wasn't avoided. It's raging on. Ukraine is not winning, and I don't think it's realistically it can be said that Ukraine will win in the end. I don't think they will win. They are losing the war, and obviously the West is not ready to enter the war against Russia. That would be a different story. But that's not the case. Then why are they saying things like, keep fighting, we'll support you forever? Is that a good thing to do? I don't think so, frankly.
No, I agree with that. But for me, the big question is, what exactly are the motives of the European Union to get into this fight with Russia in this way, this proxy war? Do you have any idea why they're so stuck on this project?
Frankly, I don't know. I have no idea. We are very critical of that. We never supported it. This is one of our areas of disagreement with Brussels. We criticize Brussels very much. With the previous U.S. administration of Biden, at least they were in the same camp. So you could say that, well, Europe is doing this because the Americans are pushing it, and the European leaders think that that's the best way for them to do. But even that was, I think, a mistake or an error. But now that there is a U.S. president who wants something else, who obviously wants to end this situation,
it's a fascinating
and focus on other things. I don't understand how Brussels can keep saying this, where we don't have the military muscle, we don't have the financial resources ready. They can, lift and raise military spending. That's a good thing to do, I think, because we need to do more for our own safety. But what is the point? Getting into a war against Russia in the end? Is that a good way forward? I don't think so.
Yeah, but
I don't think Russia is interested in that either in the long run. They would like to make a deal too. It just have to be negotiated.
You can say it's a fantastic and idealistic project of the European Union. You can also say maybe it's the last attempt to make a last attempt to hold on to this idea of a global world order in which certain liberal ideals are shared between the United States and Europe, trying to make the world ready for those ideals, and the countries who are not ready for that, it might take some time, but we'll work on that.
These are outdated ideas. I agree with what you say. These are outdated.
But I try to imagine what is going on right now.
It's a possible explanation.
It has something to do with, I think, this idea of the world order, the current of the former world order that we built since the 80s, in which a secular, modernist concept of what a country should look like, of what the world should look like, is finally coming to its end.
I think so. And I
think there is in each country, and also in the United States, this war is raging. Also within Hungary, there are people who are very critical on the course Viktor Orban chose, and they have more sympathy with, let's say, certain values you can see more in Western Europe.
Yeah, obviously.
So I think it's of a historic importance what happens right now, and this war is like the culmination point of this ideological conflict.
I think it's a good analysis what you just summarized. I think so.
Yeah,
I tend to agree with what you say. Yeah.
And of course the question is what goes on in the United States. We're still not certain of the direction. I think Donald Trump really wants to end that, and J.D. Vance is on the same side, but there are also counter powers acting in the United States.
Yeah.
So. Still, for me, I think that I tend to believe that we're in the last stage now, also of how the way Trump is acting, and he is in a way proving that the course of Viktor Orban was right. You can say it's kind of ironic, but when you see now the Ursula von der Leyen and the European leaders sitting in front of the desk of Trump. And that was the way Orban was treated, I think, a year ago. So it's like a turnaround of the positions. Yeah. But Maybe to end with this idea, and I'm really interested in your opinion on that, because you can say that Hungary was the black sheep in the European family for a long time, and it was related to your resistance against this ideological course of the Union. Also, this, let's say, globalist or imperialist, hidden imperialist globalist agenda,
yes.
in which one way of life was the only true way of life and acceptable. But you see that within our Western European societies, and the Netherlands and in France and also in the UK and Germany, very influential networks have been formed in the last decades.
Yeah.
Non-governmental, also in the media, also in all kind of agendas within the European Union is like the biotope, you can say, like of this agenda. Do you think that what is happening right now in Ukraine and the crisis Europe is going through at the moment, because I think it's evident that we can continue as a rise of populism. Orban has started this Patriots for Europe, and it's already a big party within Europe. So within the different countries, you can see that a counter movement is going on. But how do you look at the transition of the European Union itself? Could it be something like a 1989 movement, the Medan for Western Europe? Like we are now dealing with an economic ideology that is reaching its endpoint.
But there are signs that point to this direction.
You worked
Certainly.
in the Union. You experienced.
The European Parliament for 5 years until last year. Yeah, there are signs that point to this direction. Certainly, it's hard to tell exactly what will happen, obviously beforehand. But I see one fundamental problem with how the European Union functions, and especially the Brussels institutions. They have lost touch with the people. And I think the explanation, for instance, for the Patriots for Europe, how it came up, and why support increases to these ideas of patriotism, sovereignty, speaking, a simple language of the people, and representing their interests, is because many people are realizing, or have already realized, that these institutions, Brussels, no longer speak for them. They speak for ideologies. They want to put an ideological straitjacket on everybody. And if somebody doesn't want it, or has different ideas about nation, about the role of parliaments, about sovereignty, about the family, about migration, whatever, then it's punished, and then its money is held back, like they're holding back some of our money. Same thing happened with Poland when it had a conservative government, etc., etc. Some similar threats were made against Meloni when she became prime minister. So it's an ideological straitjacket that doesn't talk about the people, and it doesn't represent European interests. For instance, we're talking about the sanctions policy now against Russia because of the war. Most of those sanctions don't really work.
No.
They don't really harm Russia in any meaningful way, but they are harming the European economy. Or I can say another example, this forced green deal, or whatever it was called, the green turning the economy green in a silly way, in a stupid way, is harming the European industry. It's not done in a smart and professional way. Why? Because it's ideological. It's not talking about industry. It's not talking with the industry. It's not talking with researchers and innovation. It wants to put an obligatory new rule because ideologically this is what we think is right. That's wrong, and people are realizing this, and this is giving strength to the patriots who want to talk with the people, want to stand up for them, and talk in simple terms, about the economy, about the political situation, about geopolitics, security, identity, migration, etc. This is what I think people want to hear. So I change fundamentally and leave behind this failed political direction and these leaders that we've seen.
How would it look like? How would it look like?
Toward the people. Well, it would look like, it would mean, for instance, the European Commission that respects national identity and respects member states' decisions, and then coordinates between member states.
But with a smaller agenda.
Well, a smaller or more realistic agenda. It would look at the economy and look at the European interest, not an ideological interest, not a foreign interest, a European interest when it makes economic suggestions or decisions. It would consult more with member states instead of sending, directives about what to do. It would, for instance, propose a meeting like we are calling for. Viktor Orban has called several times for a meeting, a European-Russian meeting, an EU-Russia summit. We've never done that for several years. Europe is where it is, Russia is where it is. The EU, if it wants to speak about the whole of Europe or the European Union, needs to act, for instance, in that sense, as a player itself. Not follow necessarily an American political direction, but create its own ideas and talk about them with Russia. Just a few examples, So listen to what the people really want to hear, what their problems are, and try to find answers to that. That's populist politics, but populist in a good way.
Yeah. And I think one of the main problems of Europe, and it always has been a problem, but is right now it's becoming more and more clear. It's the question of its legitimacy.
Right.
Because why do we need Europe? And you can say it was legitimized because we would prosper. We would become more and more the European welfare would improve because of the European Union and everything. All the European institutions would improve our economies.
And to a certain time, it was true.
And that was true.
And also, I should add the striving for peace and stability together.
And this was another
a founding idea, very important.
It was a traditional arguments for the European Union: peace, prosperity, security regarding your basic needs.
And by the way,
no hunger.
And by the way, this is why Hungary has been supporting, and we still stand up for the integration of the Balkans into the EU as members. There are still members in countries in the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, that are out, Albania, that are out of the EU. I think they should be brought in to stabilize them. But you also have to understand that if you have such a big union, then you will have to accept differences within that union. You can't just have one official line for everything. Then it's going to be
Europe of the countries.
It's going to be several nations and countries and regions together, and you have to realize that.
To finish my line of thought, when prosperity, when security, when no hunger becomes the central argument for Europe, was the central argument for the creation of, in fact, the EEG and later on the European Union. Once you don't have any prosperity, but your economies go down, once you have a problem with energy and the energy prices rise, when you have problems with the fundamental rights that are threatened by Brussels and the measures that Brussels are taking, then of course the legitimacy becomes more and more problematic. And I think that's the situation we're in right now. And people say, well, what is Europe doing for us? And then you almost need this to create...
Divert attention.
To divert it, not only to divert the attention, but also to make the country stick together, because they're all in the same boat now, and they have this enemy, so they... And that's the picture, in a way, I see when I see the current leaders of the European Union, like they're sticking together because they're afraid. And they have to build this narrative also towards their own peoples that there is a serious threat from the East. And I would say there is no threat at all, but the way that this narrative is pushed in also in the media I think it's a very, very problematic, and it's a danger, because then the only direction we have as Europe is against Russia.
But that's not how it began, as you rightly said. That's exactly not how the European cooperation began, and that's not the way forward. And I think it's a dead end to continue saying these things and to continue talking about a war forever in territory of Ukraine with European money and whatever. I don't think it leads to anything good at all. And not only not good for Ukrainians, but not good for the whole of Europe either. So there needs to be a change of course, a complete change of idea. And
is this the period that we're going to see that happen? And I think in a way we feel this. And
I think it's coming closer, because
that's what I mean with the 1989 moment.
It could be. There's certainly a big change in Washington that turned the table, and not only the geopolitical idea, but also trade with the tariffs and stuff. There's a new war. I think the West, as you talked about earlier in our conversation, the West as it existed before is no longer there. There's a new world now. There are new players in Asia also, and the Western supremacy in terms of values and ideology is no longer there. We have to realize that. And if we realize that, it changes our political approach towards others, based on partnership, based on cooperation, based on your own interests, and also the respect of others who also have interests. And then you can work together. I think this is what Brussels should realize. And if they do that, then the people will be more receptive also in Europe to a united action. Right now, I think most people see Brussels as a bureaucratic, figurehead on top of our matters. Very few people really see the added value of what Brussels right now does, or what the Brussels institutions actually mean.
My final question is outlier Hungary, one of the countries that can shape this new future of Europe, you think?
I definitely believe in that. This is partly why I'm in politics and why I'm in international politics also. I think we are giving an example. We are putting a lot of effort in cooperation with our neighbors in Central Europe, in the Visegrad countries and beyond.
And that doesn't mean that that all countries should be like Hungary, but they should be like their own.
That's right. It just means that you should be your own. You should be who you are, respect us, and we respect you, and we can cooperate like that.
Well, it was nice talking to you.
It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.